Hello! I want to talk about Shakespeare. More specifically, I want to talk about my favorite Shakespearean riff/mashup in the form of an audio drama about a fictional true crime podcast that uses adaptation and genre to bring up questions about the responsibility of storytellers and how we frame narratives. Look, Arden is a podcast that was made especially for me, okay? You can listen to it as well, but it's for me. In Season 2, they have an episode that's an adaptation of Measure for Measure. No other person on the planet is subscribed to 40-plus audio dramas and also has a strong knowledge of lesser-known Shakespeare play Measure for Measure. This podcast is for me. I am the target audience. Arden is a masterfully written show, co-created by Emily St. James, Christopher Dole, and Sarah Gottlieb. It's an audio drama about a fictional true crime podcast hosted by Benedict and Beatrice from Much Ado About Nothing, reimagined in this version as Brenda Bentley and Bea Casely. And also all the crimes are based on Shakespeare. Season 1 is Romeo and Juliet, Season 2 is Hamlet. The creators have described it as a comedy that turns into a drama partway through. I have described it as a podcast which prompted me to make 2 charts, one of which is color-coded, a show I need to yell about, and a very good podcast. The last one is understatement. Now, I am going to spoil a lot of Arden with this video. Normally I wouldn't care about telling you that, but I want you to listen to Arden, and I want you to listen to it with the full experience of not fully knowing how it's going to resolve, because, among everything else that it is, Arden is a mystery, and I don't want you to know what the solution to that mystery is. So, spoiler warning, and heartfelt plea to go listen to Arden Seasons 1 and 2. Please. Narrative stewardship is a term you've never heard before because I invented it to describe who is entrusted with telling a story and when. It goes beyond just a matter of perspective or narrative voice and specifically addresses in-universe instances of a character shouldering the responsibility of telling a story. And this can be varying degrees of explicit in terms of how it occurs. One of my favorite less explicit examples is from The World's End. The film opens with narration from Gary, placing the story of the first Golden Mile firmly in his stewardship and implicitly setting you up to think of the events of the movie from his perspective. However, it ends with narration from Andy, telling a group of people about the events of the film and retroactively applying his perspective to the story. The narrative has now passed into his care, and he is the one sharing it and bringing it forward. However, this switch isn't the result of any explicit conversation that Gary and Andy have. Gary never tells Andy to tell the story, nor does it directly communicate that everything we've seen is something that Andy has been telling. There are scenes he just wasn't there for one thing. Whatever version he tells the other people in the circle, it isn't exactly what we've seen. The point is that the story of the first Golden Mile is in Gary's care and the second in Andy's. In this instance, drawing attention to narrative stewardship serves more of a thematic purpose in order to underscore what the movie's trying to say about the past and how we interact with it. For a more literal example, you can look at The Lord of the Rings. In fiction, the books that you read when you read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are a translation of the Red Book of Westmarch, which was primarily written by Bilbo and Frodo and was finished by Sam. Frodo directly, in the story, tasks Sam with the work of writing the end, and there's analysis out there that pinpoints the shift to within a few lines. So, that's narrative stewardship. It doesn't always have to be defined by a shift from one character to another, and there are a lot of situations under which it can be applied, probably some I haven't even thought of, but that's what I mean when I use the term, and it's something that I think about a lot when it comes up. Arden interacts with the concept of narrative stewardship on a few occasions, first and most obviously in its format as a true crime podcast. Throughout Season 1, Bea and Brenda are telling the story of Ralph and Julie. They have not been entrusted with this story by the people who it actually concerns. They have just taken it on themselves, and they're each doing it for different but similar reasons. Bea sets out to tell Julie's story, not just to share and find out what happens to her, but because of a connection she feels she has with Julie, and because she feels she has some responsibility or duty to be the one who says what happened. Brenda is there for Ralph. She barges in and kind of strong-arms her way into the in-universe Arden podcast because she wants to make sure that Ralph's end of the story is being done justice, and at the core of her involvement in the rest of the season is her desire to prove that Ralph isn't responsible for Julie going missing. Bea and Brenda each feel they have some responsibility to one of the key players in Season 1, and each feel that they have a right to tell the story because of their involvement at the time. Bea as a reporter, and Brenda as one of the police officers investigating the case. However, Julie and Ralph don't want their story to be told. They don't even want to be the ones telling it. They left it unresolved with intent. So when they do step in and are all but forced to take over stewardship of their own story from Bea and Brenda, it's kind of an act of self-defense. They don't want to be doing it, but they need to in order to justify or at least explain their actions. In-universe, episode 11, The Monsters Who Did It, doesn't actually exist, but the in-universe equivalent of this reluctant repossession of stewardship is when Julie agrees to answer Bea and Brenda's questions on mic once they find her. Of course, doing so means owning up to all of the things that she did. In season 1 of Arden, narrative stewardship means responsibility. Julie's responsibility for the various crimes she committed to orchestrate her disappearance, and Bea, Brenda, and the rest of the Arden team's responsibility for negatively impacting the lives of at least 3 people. So of course for season 2 they shake things up a little. Dana Hamill wants her story to be told. Dana Hamill wants Arden to tell her story to as wide an audience as possible. Dana Hamill wants the world to know what happened to her father and why the actions of her uncle and, to a lesser extent, her mother should be considered a suspect in light of what happened. The question of narrative stewardship shifts in season 2. The matter of how one person's memory of the past can differ from another's and how that affects how they tell the story of what happened comes up directly a number of times. Dana's impressions of her father as compared to those of Trudy and Clyde, Dana and Olivia's differing perspectives on their romantic relationship, Bea and Brenda's different impressions of their initial interactions in 2007 and how that affects their present relationship. But most noteworthy for our purposes are the change in form that the podcast takes and one Rosalind Ursula. The Arden team is aware that after the disaster that was the end of season 1, they need to be more careful with how they approach season 2, and as a result, the episodes that we hear are not at all what the in-universe podcast, A Town Called Elsinore, actually consists of. So while Bea and Brenda are trying to tell Dana's story, what we get is not just their version of that story. Moreover, their perspective of what the story they're telling actually is very different from Dana's perspective on the story she wants them to tell. They are more aware of the possible consequences of taking responsibility for telling the story, and so they are more wary of fully doing so. Which brings us back to Rosalind. Okay. So, Rosalind Ursula takes her first name from the main character of As You Like It, a character who would definitely 100%, no doubt, get along with Hamlet so very well that one of my main takeaways from this podcast is turning over that possibility in my mind. Her last name, Ursula, is a nod to a minor character in Much Ado About Nothing, which ties her back into Brenda and Bea as reimaginings of Benedict and Beatrice, but other than that, doesn't have much bearing on her character. She's not an adaptation of Ursula in any form. And it's interesting to note that she is one of the few characters in the podcast who is based in Shakespeare, but is brought in without bringing other elements of the play from which they are taken. The only other contribution As You Like It makes to Arden is the name, and even that is more strongly connected to the real-life forest of Arden outside Shakespeare's hometown than it is As You Like It's fictional Arden in France. Even Andy Wayface is actually surprisingly similar to Andrew Aguichi, what with his willingness to throw his money around and comedic attempt to get married with vague motivations as to why he actually wants to. Though that is retained without importing much else from Twelfth Night, the only other Twelfth Night reference being Malcolm Volio in season 1. But Rosalind, she does bear a similarity to her Shakespearean namesake in terms of character as much as any other Arden character does, but not in terms of role. And the fact that she has been taken so entirely outside of her original context gives her leeway to be a more flexible character for the writers while still maintaining that connection to Shakespeare. And what the writers do with that is make her Horatio. I can still remember listening to season 2 for the first time and realizing that Rosalind was going to be acting as Horatio, and I think I actually got goosebumps because Horatio is the person who has stewardship of the story of Hamlet. Hamlet entrusts him at the end of the play with the task of telling this story. In the world of Hamlet, the only way the story of all the death and tragedy, the carnal, bloody, and unnatural acts gets told is because of Horatio, and we know he tells it at least once to Fortinbras when he shows up at the end. Dana gets Rosalind to tell her story. She contacts Arden generally, but Rosalind is the one that does the groundwork of flying out to Montana to look into Dana's story in preparation for the in-universe season 2, and as a result of befriending Dana, Rosalind is swayed to her perspective on the events and becomes the only person on the Arden team advocating for the version of the story that Dana wants them to tell. This interacts with some other aspects of adaptation in ways that I'll get to in a little bit, but first and foremost, it makes her a really good Horatio, by which I mostly mean it makes her a very Horatio. She really takes her responsibility as steward of Dana's story, as the person entrusted with her version of events, very seriously. To Rosalind, this is Dana's story, as much as in season 1, Bea saw it as Julie's story almost at the exclusion of Ralph. And so, first and foremost, Rosalind considers Arden's responsibility in telling this story to be doing right by Dana. At least until she realizes she's gotten too close to Dana and comes clean to the rest of the crew about the gaps in Dana's story. Season 2 asks questions about the role of objectivity in narrative stewardship, because if someone asks you to tell their story of what happened to them, what do you do when that conflicts with just telling the story of what happened? Arden isn't fully an adaptation. Partially because it's got so much original stuff that there are entire plot lines that can't be found in Shakespeare, but partially because it's never a straight-up retelling of any of the plays that it covers. There's always enough distance from Shakespeare's original text, story, and themes that despite the obvious influence, it also stands on its own as a new version of older stories, which is actually very in line with how Shakespeare approached his plays. With very few exceptions, they're all based on existing stories or historical events. Some plays are a combination of 2 or more stories. They vary greatly in faithfulness from play to play, but in general, Shakespeare plays are not original. They're just really good at standing on their own. But none of Shakespeare's plays are mysteries. There aren't even twists or reveals. Villains tell the audience what they're up to, the chorus synopsizes events before they happen. Foreknowledge of the ending will not in any way hamper your enjoyment of the story. So Arden is actually given a very difficult task in adapting stories that everybody knows into a true crime format where the reveal of what happened or who did it needs to actually hold some weight. That approach to adapting the plays essentially requires a genre shift, since the aims of a mystery are directly at odds with the aims of the kinds of tragedy that Shakespeare was writing. And the really amazing thing is how it's done differently between the 2 seasons. Next season, Arden is going to be covering Midsummer Night's Dream, and I'm really excited to see how that is different in an entirely different genre of Shakespeare play as their source, but it hasn't come out yet, so I'm just talking about tragedies. Everyone knows how Romeo and Juliet ends. The prologue of the play tells you how it ends, just in case you didn't know. And listening to season 1, you already know what happens to Ralph and Julie, because you know they're Romeo and Juliet. Well, you should know they're Romeo and Juliet. You might not know the details, but you know they're both dead, and you know they died together. Season 1 relies on that foreknowledge to keep both the real-world audience and the in-fiction audience engaged. Even if you somehow manage to miss the fact that Ralph Montgomery and Julie Capsum are Romeo and Juliet, in fiction, everyone making and listening to the show knows what happened to Julie Capsum. All that blood, the car crash, she died, for sure. They just don't know how. So, when the twist is revealed and it turns out they're not only not dead, but still together and thriving, you, like the in-universe audience, are surprised by it. It's like undoing any dramatic irony that existed in the original. Also, if you're me, you're kind of more emotionally affected by the twist than you were by the original ending, because you were prepared for them to be dead, goddammit. You had years to accept that, but for them to be alive and happy, you wrote a story where they're alive and happy. How dare you? How dare you change their fates and show me what could have been, because now the fact that that story has ended in death for a whole 400 years makes it that much sadder. Anyway, Season 2 builds on that. Season 2 is an elevation of Season 1 in pretty much every way, honestly, and that comes with a further departure from the source material, and a more deliberate obfuscation of what the audience expects from Hamlet. Because in order for the mystery to be sustained in a manner which fits the format of an investigation, we can't have Hamlet given concrete knowledge of the culprit from the murder victim at the very start of the story. Yes, in Hamlet, Hamlet has his doubts as to whether the ghost is telling the truth and to whether it's even really his father, but the audience isn't really in doubt. We know, both because of the narrative and because Hamlet is, very famous. So, Arden lacks an articulate ghost describing the murder in detail. The listener is still predisposed to suspect Clyde because you've read or seen or are just culturally aware of Hamlet. But that suspicion is shaken by the way they changed how the story went in Season 1, so who knows what could happen. And this is an amazing exercise in getting you to think about a story differently, because the way that Hamlet is written, giving the audience knowledge as to what Hamlet is doing and why, because of his interaction with the ghost, makes Hamlet's actions and the fact that he suspects Claudius the way he does more or less makes sense to us in a way it doesn't to the characters who are actually in the play. We know that he has his reasons for all of the weird stuff that he's doing, and even if you don't agree with how he goes about it, you can probably see a justification for it. To the other characters in the play, with the notable exception of Horatio, Hamlet's actions are absolutely wild, and his entire plan kind of hinges on that. In Arden, we're not following Dana directly. We're following her via Bea and Brenda's investigation, and that investigation is also following all the other major players in the town. That shift in how we are presented with our Hamlet figure removes the perspective of knowing whodunit, probably, if ghosts are to be believed, even if some shadow of it is still there due to cultural awareness of Hamlet. It's basically asking you to relate not to Hamlet, but to Claudius and Gertrude and Polonius and Ophelia, all the people who are worried about just what it is Hamlet's up to. And that is an amazing trick to pull off. Let's go back to Rosalind and Horatio, because Horatio is actually monumentally important to understanding Hamlet as a person for much of the play. Arden puts that into much sharper focus by having Rosalind literally trying to shape what the in-universe audience hears of Dana's story, to the point of deleting footage and impeding Brenda and Bea's investigation in doing so. Horatio is tasked by Hamlet with telling his story, and Arden asks us to question the ethics of that in the framework of true crime, as well as to question Horatio's objectivity. It's asking, but what if Hamlet wasn't right? What if Claudius didn't do it? What if Horatio is a friend who is so loyal that he was misled by this incredibly charismatic individual? And that, I don't even know what to do with that, and I like it a lot. Now, no discussion of our access to Dana's inner thoughts and motivations would be complete without a mention of the soliloquies. In Arden, the soliloquies are masterfully adapted into Dana's songs written by Laura Stratford. They serve the same purpose as a soliloquy in that they give us access to Dana's inner thoughts and emotions, but they also emphasize the element of performance that is at play in Dana's actions. Performance is a big part of Hamlet's actions in the play. There's a really amazing ambiguity in just how much of his actions are performance and when he's performing and when he's not can vary from production to production. Is Hamlet aware that Claudius and Polonius are watching him during To Be or Not to Be, for instance? Some of Dana's songs happen in more private moments. Show 'Em I Mean Business, notably, and arguably Let's Go Watch the Fire. But most of them are in public, drawing the audience's attention to the fact that while Dana's emotions about her father's death and the ensuing situation are genuine, she is still performing. And when and how she's performing and for whom is immensely interesting. She presents different facets of herself to Olivia, the Arden crew, Trudy and Clyde, and in doing so, her version of events is increasingly brought into question, rightfully so, as is later revealed, and her role as someone who has a version of this story to tell is made increasingly unreliable. Dana's songs also tie back into narrative stewardship, by the by underscoring the fact that Dana has entrusted her story to Rosalind and the Arden crew by having the final song, a song written by Dana, sung by Rosalind and some of the other members of the cast. In the commentary for episode 6 of season 2, Christopher Dole says,
"Who has the right to tell another person's story? And how do we decide that's okay? And what is the storyteller getting out of choosing this story?"
And those questions really are at the heart of Arden to me. They tie in very strongly to the format of a true crime show, but I think they also tie in to questions that are brought up by adaptation and by retelling the same story. Theater, and particularly Shakespeare, are in this strange position where you can tell the exact same story in completely different circumstances, with entirely new people, sets, context, staging. All of these choices can be very different production to production, but you are essentially telling the same story. And any act of adaptation is carrying over some of that legacy with it, some of the same spirit. Any act of retelling an old story, a story that's been told several times before, is choosing what stays and what doesn't. How we frame the narrative, whose story it becomes, from whose perspective does it get told, who is entrusted with a story, and what they do with it.